But with respect to what the Bush administration is doing regarding the UN global gun grab, at July's Small Arms Conference at UN headquarters, a State Department official by the name of John Bolton sort of took a lot of heat from the others gathered there because he gave a speech in which he said that the U.S. government would not support any program of action coming out of that conference which had a doctrinaire rejection of the idea that non-state actors or civilians could possess firearms. And the specific reference that Mr. Bolton made was to opposition groups abroad who might be fighting against tyrannical governments. That was useful as far as it went. The problem was, with respect to our own domestic situation, Mr. Bolton said that America has a long and proud tradition of private ownership of firearms for recreation, for hunting, people who own private gun collections as a historical interest and things of that sort. And that's all very well and good, but he didn't mention the fact that firearms historically have been a tool of self-defense for Americans, and historically they have been regarded, especially by the founders of our country and the drafters of the Constitution, as an ultimate check on the ambitions of our own government should it grow corrupt. He didn't talk about that. And ultimately the Bush administration joined the global consensus on behalf of the UN's program of action, which envisions an ultimate abolition of the right, universally, of the right of individuals.
Well, there's a time I think there's a universal desire for abolition of unwarranted violence.
Certainly.
Don't you think?
I would
I
agree with that.
don't just mean Columbine. I mean the incident in Germany that happened in the past week
just
and
a couple of
so.
weeks ago today, I think.
Right. Okay. You know, all those cases of private gun owners running amok. And at times like those, there's a certain appeal to wanting to rid the world of all firearms.
But nobody's talking about ridding the world of firearms. They're talking about government officials having a monopoly on firearms. When talking with an opponent of civilian possession of firearms, I will generally say something like this. You want to do away with all the guns, right? I'll say, certainly, the world would be a better place if we did away with all the guns. And I will say, if guns are done away with, how will you collect taxes? And they'll say, well, I suppose some people should still have guns. To which I will respond, you want to put exclusively in the hands of the most dangerous people in any given society the right to use firearms.
Wait, with the most dangerous people being government officials?
Being government officials. If you take a look, once again, at the sorry annals of 20th century political mass murder, once again, while private crime committed by irresponsible and criminally minded private citizens is a horrible scourge, it is dwarfed into insignificance by the violence committed by corrupt governments. There's a study, it's a dismal and horrifying study, but a very valuable one nonetheless, that was compiled by Professor R.J. Rummel of the University of Hawaii. He's a political science professor, and he teaches courses in the study of peace at the University of Hawaii. The study is entitled Death by Government. It was published in 1994. And what Professor Rummel had done was he studied all of the episodes of political mass murder of which we have record from the 20th century up until 1987. He studied the wars as well, and he came away with a rather sobering and sorrowful conclusion, which is, first of all, that unaccountable government is the most dangerous thing of which we have record. It's more deadly than war, it's more deadly than disease, it's more deadly than natural disasters. That between 1900 and 1987, over 170 million people were killed by their own governments in time of peace, and that warfare, as bad as it is, and it's a horrible scourge, and it's something that governments do, private citizens don't go to war. As bad as government is, unaccountable government is much deadlier than war. And what the United Nations represents, as embodied in the preamble to its founding charter, is the promise of ridding the world of the scourge of war. In exchange for what? In exchange for the centralization of political power in an unaccountable elite that ultimately would have a monopoly on the use of force, recreating on a global scale the conditions that Professor Rummel analyzes and defines as the precursor for mass murder. And I don't think that's a really good exchange, quite frankly.
Can the argument be made that people who elect a corrupt or murderous government get what they deserve?
You know, H.L. Mencken thought so. He said famously that democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. But the problem here is that often what you will have is one man, one vote once. I mean, in 1933, in the crucial election...
That was my next question. Did the German people deserve Hitler?
I don't think they did. I don't think anybody deserved Hitler. Well, a plurality of the Germans voted for Hitler, and
right. Not a majority.
A slightly smaller plurality voted for the communist candidate. Between those two movements, and Stalin, of course, had ordered the German Communist Party to support Hitler, the operative phrase for the German communists was "Nach Hitler kommen wir," after Hitler we come. And so they supported the election of Adolf Hitler on the assumption that he would so immiserate the German population that the field would be cleared for their ascent to power. And the problem here is that there was a large and very civilized element of German society that didn't understand what Hitler represented because he had disguised his ambitions. Here was somebody who was a creation of the dregs of the Bohemian counterculture in Germany, who had disguised himself as a champion of middle-class values and the savior of the economically strapped Germany. And after he was elected, one of the first things that happened, of course, was the Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, which gave him total power. And he immediately began to undermine and subvert all of the checks and balances that existed under the Weimar Constitution. And one of the things that he immediately did was to start consolidating, militarizing, and centralizing all of the formerly independent police agencies of Germany, put them under the control of his own party, his ruling party. And by 1938, the National Socialist government in Germany had begun the active disarmament of everybody but Nazi Party officials and civilians who were allied in some way with the Nazi Party. And so it was an outgrowth of that whole program. And this was all done in the name of preserving peace and public order in National Socialist Germany. And of course, that regime became an engine of mass destruction, warfare, and genocide.
Germany is an extreme example, but you're implying here that power is inherently corrupting.
Power is inherently corrupting. We enjoy, as Americans, no happy immunity to the tendency for corruption that we recognize in other governments and in other people. Our founding fathers knew that. They wrote a constitution to limit what they could do. Their operative assumption is that they could not be trusted with power. I mean, George Washington was the type of a man, for all of his faults, he had the normal allotment of faults. He had an extraordinary allotment of heroic character attributes as well. But he was somebody who would leave the room when praise was being directed at him because he understood his own susceptibility to pride. That's a good measure of the type of men who wrote a constitution to limit by law what they could do as members of the government, the representative government in our republic. And I think that insight is one that has been validated time and time again by subsequent history rather than vitiated by it.
Go back to the global gun grab for just a minute. Are we seeing here an attempt at grabbing power by certain people, or are we seeing good intentions
We're seeing both.
gone awry?
We're seeing, for heaven's sake, there is nothing more dangerous in politics than militant good intentions. I think that most organizations, the UN not being an exception, that have grand ambitions attract a disproportionate number of people who have good ambitions, who are honorable and upstanding people who want to do good. No organization can long exist if it doesn't attract at least some people who are competent and worthwhile and trustworthy. That's even true of criminal
Well, that's the appeal of politics, isn't it? The chance to both do good and do well.
The problem here is that the more refined your intentions, the more blind you become, really, to the downside of the powers you're accumulating. And a government which, operating on the assumption that it must be empowered to do good, can either become corrupted by the innate corruptibility of well-meaning people, or that machinery can be seized by people who are less inclined to do good. Until 1938, most of the measures used by Adolf Hitler to consolidate power were perfectly legal under the Weimar Constitution, which had been written with an unduly optimistic view of human nature. The people who wrote that Constitution and created that government didn't envision a possibility that within a few years they would be turning over the machinery of government to somebody who had a psychopathic nature and the intention to set the world in flames. But that's indeed what happened. And the same thing has happened on a lesser scale in other governments as well. And it's something innate in human nature to abuse power once it's given.
Is it fair to say that your view of government is also in tune with your view of human nature?
What is government but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?
All right, what I'm getting at is I guess, basically your view of government is based on the book of Genesis. Am I reading this right? The humankind is essentially fallen by its very nature?
Yeah, I've seen nothing in recorded history.
Capable of flaws, capable of all kinds of sins of pride and things like that?
Exactly. Yeah, very much so. I mean, Madison very famously wrote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. We'd have the government that the angels enjoy, presumably, which is the government administered by God. We don't have that option right now. We have to create a government of some
sort. So in your view, the essential function of government is as a check on our more base human impulses.
It is to protect life, liberty, and property of the law-abiding. That's the sole and exclusive legitimate role of government, is a protective function. I believe it was John Locke, it might have been John Locke, it might have been Frederick Bastiat, I'm pretty sure it was Locke, who said that government is the communal organization of the individual right to self-defense, which is why we have an army. It's why we have a navy. You know, the army is an interesting situation. Our founding fathers were leery of a standing army of occupation. They had felt the effects of a standing army that was controlled by a remote political elite. And so they inserted a clause into Article 1 of the Constitution requiring that the Army have an appropriation lasting no more than 2 years, so that Congress could exercise that type of a check over the possibility of the Army becoming a domestic menace. But Congress is given the right to maintain a Navy being, in concept, a purely defensive shield of our borders and our coastline. And that's a good example of, once again, this communal exercise of the individual right to self-defense. There are things that we delegate to the government that we cannot efficiently do for ourselves. I really don't think we can maintain a private navy, for instance.
No.
But with respect
to... Nor coin money.
Exactly.
Well, we could. But
we could.
Tough.
I mean, it'd be called counterfeiting unless we work for the Federal Reserve, in which case it's called legal tender, but that's another discussion for another time.
Right.
But with respect to the protection of one's home, one's family, one's immediate community, that's a function we really cannot delegate to government. And we shouldn't want to create a government in which we would be under the constant protective scrutiny of government. That would become what is commonly called a police state. I don't really like to use that expression because I think that puts police into a bad light. I call it a robber state rather than a police state.
But you're implying here that any organization that can protect you can also oppress you.
Yes.
At the same time.
It can.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons.
It's easy to fall from one category to the other.
And unfortunately, in most places today, whether you're talking about in Asia or in Africa or in Latin America, some places in Europe, the police serve the function of protecting the regime at the expense of the rights and liberty of the governed. There was a really interesting discussion at the UN Small Arms Conference during one presentation on the abuse of firearms in Central Africa. There's a fellow from, I believe, Sierra Leone by the name of Isaac Lapia, who talked about the fact that almost all of the gun-related violence in his country was being carried out by the government and by militias that were controlled by the government. Very interesting disclosure. He was the only person in that entire 2-week conference to admit that the people to whom the United Nations wants to give this monopoly on firearms are the leading offenders through firearms violence of the rights of innocent and law-abiding civilians.
If we